Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here with the next video in our Capoferro Rapier series. And today, as you might have guessed, we are covering the use of Rapier and Dagger. This combination of weapons was very popular throughout both the 16th and 17th centuries within the Italian fencing tradition, and Capoferro, like many other masters, devotes a reasonable proportion of his book to this style of fencing. He does cover other companion weapons as well, namely the cloak and the shield, but I won't talk about these today. We'll just focus on the rapier and dagger. It's also worth noting that this is a large and complex topic, which is beyond the scope of this single video to cover in its entirety. So what I'm going to try to do today is isolate a few simple general principles which you can go away and practice to develop a bit of a feel for the use of these weapons in combination in this style. However, there are many special techniques and even a couple of unique guard stances for these weapons used together. If you're interested in this, I recommend you go and find yourself a copy or a translation of Capoferro's treatise and read up a bit on it for yourself. However, that said, let's get started with the presentation. So I'm going to cover essentially a couple of different topics. Firstly, we'll look at how to stand on guard with the weapons. And then secondly, I'll talk about the defensive uses of the dagger. And it is primarily a defensive tool. At the end of the video, I'll cover very briefly how you might use this as an offensive weapon in the system, but it's actually quite rare to do so. So this is mostly a defensive arm. Right, first of all, guard stance. So I'm going to focus only on the three core guards, the ones that we use most of the time in the Capoferro system, namely seconda, terza and quarta, or second, third and fourth guard stances. I'll start with terza because it's the principal defensive guard, which we usually start an exchange in, and then I'll show how the stance is shifted into the more aggressive seconda and quarta postures. So the most important thing to understand about Capoferro's approach is that the dagger is held in a relatively relaxed, partially extended position, just a little bit out from the chest. So this is a ready position rather than a committed, proactive position. To demonstrate what I mean, ignoring the dagger for now, this is my terza guardia with a single rapier. So the dagger is held here. So it's a little bit forwards of the chest on the inside line, but behind the hilt of my sword. And the tip of the dagger should just be angled a little bit towards the opponent. Looking in this direction. So here's my single rapier, terza guardia, and here's the same guard with the dagger held in this ready position, partially extended. Not fully extended, not completely contracted, partially extended. There's not one precise position where you're supposed to hold this. It could be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, a little bit further forwards, a little bit further back. Depends on where it's comfortable for you and also what's happening tactically in the fight. But the main point is it's held ready for action, but not in a strained, extended or committed position. When we move into the more aggressive stances, seconda or quarta, the dagger actually just stays where it is relative to your body. So you just keep your arm in the relaxed, partially extended position. Because your torso is changing angle, the dagger will shift in space one way or the other. But that's okay. We're just going to leave it in this casual, ready position. So here's terza. I'm going to move into quarta guardia. So my dagger's moved in this direction a little, but not proactively on my part. It's just the change in angulation of my body that's moved it up. Terza, terza, quarta. And the same thing happens moving into seconda on the outside line. It drops down in this direction because of this little twist of my torso. Terza, seconda, terza, seconda. So that's really the first thing to train and practice if you're trying to learn some of this at home. Just get used to shifting from stance to stance and keeping the dagger in a ready position, prepared for action, regardless of whether that's an offensive action or a defensive action. Okay, so next topic is how to use the dagger to help protect ourselves while we are attacking against our opponent. So we'll use the principal attack, the stoccata, as an example. Ignoring the sword for now, the dagger is going to move from its ready position and be extended out from the shoulder so that the arm is fully extended forward but not locked. And the dagger will be aimed into the gap in our defense. So whenever we move our sword forward, some kind of gap, for example down here, will open in our defense. So the idea is we're going to move our dagger into wherever that gap is. And the idea is basically just to give us more coverage from any possible counter-time thrust that our opponent might launch. So I'll show you a couple of examples of that, but this is quite a fluid technique which will need to be adapted to whatever the specific tactical situation is. So please bear in mind these are only examples. So if I'm facing in this direction, I'm on guard in terza. I gain my opponent's sword on the inside line in this quarta-like position, and then I extend my sword to do the stoccata and also the dagger. So I'm pushing my dagger up here to protect this line to my face. Once again, on guard, gain, stoccata and cover. As an example of what might happen in the other line, if I'm on guard in terza, I gain my opponent's sword on the outside line, then as I extend my sword to make the stoccata, I will just drop my dagger down and push it forwards to plug this gap in my defense to my ribs. Once I've finished the attack, of course, I should return to a guard stance where the dagger is contracted back in to a relaxed, ready posture, prepared for whatever comes next. Okay, so we're not going to leave it out here, committed to one particular line. We're going to be expanding it out and contracting it back like this, moving from the shoulder. When you're performing this sort of cover with the dagger, if you have the opportunity to actively oppose your opponent's sword blade with the dagger in a physical way, then so much the better. If you don't manage to make physical contact with the dagger, that's fine. It's still actually performing a useful purpose. It's covering a gap which your opponent might look to disengage into. So it's cutting down his options. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to how we use the dagger during defensive techniques when our opponent is attacking us. There are two things to consider briefly here. How the dagger is used during a parry and riposte, and how the dagger might be used during a defensive cavazione or freeing of the sword. If you're performing a scanso, a dodge or avoidance technique, the dagger is kind of irrelevant because you're not actually trying to oppose the opponent's blade for the most part in these techniques. So we will ignore the scansi, the avoidances for now. So parry and riposte, first of all. There are basically two ways you can use the dagger during a parry and riposte. You can either use it to support the action of the sword, or you can simply parry with your dagger by itself. Using both weapons together kind of makes a little bit more sense within Capoferro's system, in my opinion, but both would be options. So, we're on guard in terza, our defensive stance, and our opponent decides to attack us on the inside line. I could just parry with my sword, like so, or I could parry with my dagger, like so, or more likely I'm going to parry with both weapons together. And after I've secured the parry, I will maintain opposition, or at least coverage, with my dagger as I extend the sword into the stoccata riposte. Okay, so the double weapon parry again, parry inside, riposte. And the dagger is extended forwards during the riposte for exactly the same reasons we described previously. For opponents attacking on the outside line, we have the same options available. For on guard in terza, I can just parry with the sword, like so. I could reach forwards and parry just with the dagger, like so. But even better, I'll extend both weapons into the attack to parry them together, and then make the riposte like so. So that's a pretty simple way to use the dagger during the parry. So we're using it to support the action of the sword, or if we're feeling confident, to replace the sword in the parry and leave the sword a little bit freer for a quicker riposte. But my feeling of the system is that parrying with both weapons together is probably the way to go most of the time. Okay, now we have to think about how we use the dagger during a cavazione, and here things get very interesting. So, if I'm on guard in terza and my opponent advances and gains my sword, I will drop the tip of my sword and shift my weight back to free my sword, to extract it, and then seek to come up on the other line to do a counter gain with my opponent's sword. That's a standard technique that we've looked at before. So the dagger can help in a couple of different ways here. Firstly, as I perform the cavazione, I can move the dagger a little bit forwards to plug that gap in my defense. So if my opponent's good and quick and tries to launch a counter-time attack during my cavazione, I can simply parry it with the dagger and then riposte with the sword. So I do the cavazione, parry with the dagger, riposte with the sword. Or, if I have the opportunity to complete the cavazione, I drop the sword to free it, and I come up to gain the opponent's sword, and I can gain with both weapons, or at least cover a little bit more of myself with the dagger, and then launch our usual counter attack against the opponent, as always extending the dagger from the shoulder. So we have a couple of subtle variations on the same thing. If I'm facing this direction, as I move back to free the sword, I'm moving my dagger just a little bit forwards to plug the gap. That can be used to then gain the sword as I move out of the cavazione, or I can parry and interrupt a counter-time attack, leaving my sword free for the riposte. So, those are a few very general basic principles to go away and experiment with a little bit, just to get used to coordinating these two weapons, and to get used to that core idea that the dagger is held in a relaxed, ready position. During a technique, it's extended out quickly from the shoulder to support the action of the sword, and when the technique is finished, it's contracted back to the ready position, prepared for the next technique or exchange. So I'm going to finish the video by talking about the offensive capabilities of the dagger. Obviously, 17th century Daggers were weapons in their own right. They usually had two sharp edges and a very sharp point. So you could, of course, launch an attack against the opponent using the dagger. In Capoferro's system, because of the nature of the stances and the measure, the distance that you fence at, can be quite a challenge to actually strike the opponent with the dagger because they are relatively far away from you. However, if you do wish to attack with a dagger, the main attack, which is shown in the treatise, is a direct thrust with the tip of the dagger aimed at the face of the opponent. So obviously this can only be launched realistically from narrow measure, misura stretta, and it makes sense to do so, makes most sense to do so if you've either done a very deep gain of the opponent's weapon going forward, so you've managed to gain his sword at the narrow measure, or after a parry. And the thrust is basically an extended arm thrust performed in combination with the passato, so that's the full passing step forwards. So for example, if I'm on guard in terza, I parry my opponent on the outside and I see they're a little bit too close and their face is exposed, I simply thrust forwards from my shoulder and step with the left foot, leaving the sword here, of course, to cover my vulnerable inside line. So this is a very simple example of how a dagger attack might happen. So if you want to practice it, it's something interesting to throw into the mix. So I'll quickly show that again. You're on guard in terza, the opponent attacks your outside line, you perform a parry with sword, their face is exposed, so you extend from the shoulder and step with the left leg, covering with the sword. Guard, sword parry, passato dagger thrust with the cover. When you're practicing with any of these techniques, always remember to recover to a guard stance once the technique's finished, and have the dagger recover to the half-extended ready position, relaxed and ready for use. Okay, that's it for today. I have really rushed through a complex topic, even though I'm restricting myself to the core basics, but it's just to give you a little bit of a taster for these weapons, and perhaps to give you a bit of insight as to how Capoferro's system compares to other systems of sword and dagger. So I hope you found that interesting. Please give it a go at home, see what you think of it, and I shall return in the near future with the next video in our series. Until then, take care everyone. See you next time.